Hello everyone, today we talk about Hussite tactics. We actually never talked about the Hussite wars in general, not even in the manualistic medieval history videos, and today we actually deal just with the tactical side of the story, and however more as an introduction, as actually I want to make a video for each battle of the Hussite wars, at least the most important ones. The historical context, this war of, could say of religion, but, involving actually deep political reasons in the lands of the Bohemian crown, and this essentially reform, prelude to major reforms of the century. Afterwards, it manifested in places, in fact, like Bohemia, like England. Religious movements that were deeply rooted with the revival of a new spiritual sensitivity, new political social experiments, overlapping with the fairly unstable institutional profile of Central European monarchies, at least the gradual construction of properly could start talking about national monarchies, but often in an elective fashion, so that the actual control these kingdoms would grow, as a dynastic collection of crowns, and the local nobility especially trying to do this to safeguard its own privileges. This is typical. We made a lot of videos about Hungary, Bohemia, Poland, dealing exactly with this, and also, however, with a what could be called as a emerging sense of national awareness that was wired not as a Czech versus German struggle, and the thing would be complicated already by the fact, of course, in Bohemia there were a lot of German communities that, properly with the hostility towards a certain level of foreign intervention at the highest spheres of politics and institutions, had not much to do. The Hussite wars are actually showing this strange couple, sometimes of the Bohemian, not just gentry, but properly nobility that sided with these peasants that were creating radical communities, of kind of communistic order that properly were associating and being supported by this higher, local, let's say, ethnic nobility, that for interests that are obviously devoid of any specific sympathy for at least the political and social side of the story. Spiritually speaking, also could say that religion played an important part, especially in the Taborite, the most radical of this side movement that at some point caused the split with the Utrapists that sided with the Catholics of Sigismund, and also within the Saint Taborists, for example, the Adamites that were exterminated by the former, also because of their radical refusal of the Eucharist. So there is actually a very complex picture in here that we will have to put together at some point. It's not easy, right? Because this is a chapter that I remember when I first made a video about 14th century Bohemia. I was rightfully corrected at some points, stressing this thing that you often still find in manuals that are even updated, to the very last academic generations, that this was a sort of kind of a national thing, right? Of course, there was some to it in a proto aspect, but it wasn't fundamental. And this is showed by the very details of the historical reality of those times and places that, in fact, we should talk more about. For now, we've just done something, introductive. So we will leave all this aside for now, because we talk about tactics today. And I would like also, as we were saying, to make of it a broader introduction to a very interesting aspect of medieval warfare, surely of great innovation, something that wasn't properly, revolutionary or procuring kind of more modern transformations, as people say, this is the first example of tanks, talking about the Wagenburg, or better, this war wagons, as we're called. I will try to pronounce a lot of Czech words today, and of course I will fail miserably. But the Vodzov, the war wagons, this lager fortress, fundamentally, that was distinctive element of Hussite tactics. They weren't just about that, because of course this is something that we will try to explain now, also in parallel to other tactics that were being used. It was not the first time such tactics was employed, for example, but in the case of the Hussite warfare, it came to be determinant for the outcome, the positive outcome actually of many battles that saw this astonishing also numerical inferiority of the Hussites against the imperial cavalry. And by the 15th century, I really hate how in disclosure in books that are sold a bit all over, since the 80s, the 90s, there's this idea that, by the 15th century warfare now was more democratic, right? That cavalry had become useful, that the heavily armored knights were completely outdated. Well, this is absolute nonsense by any standard, right? By the late medieval times, there was, if anything, a refeudalization of warfare, right? Especially after the first half of the 14th century. Knights weren't outdated at all, right? And this is especially a context where this is not true, right? Because these Central European lands were actually still pretty traditional in many ways, pretty conservative, simply for lack of means, telling the truth. And this should partially explain also why the wagon fort tactic came about, right? It's not it's a broader part of a political and social background of these countries, as we've seen, but also strategic needs in areas that were fundamentally mostly rural, right? Few there were communities at various times, but these weren't dramatically urbanized areas. There weren't a great deal of infrastructures. The same wagon fort represents, in a way, in this context, something that of course responds to this, and that could have not formed in other areas of Europe, right? My understanding is that if the same tactics had been used in France, where the first you look at the Burgundian army as it was starting to develop together with the French one in a more unitary fashion, or in Italy where the condotta was being regularized in a more subtle sense. There was these two areas important areas of development of artillery, for example, and we will see that the wagon force were actually vulnerable to this. Things would have been different, right? If we don't have to attribute to these tactics, if you really want to complement them and understand them for what they were as an extremely clever and especially extremely difficult thing to achieve, to make it something like any tactic, by the way, as some genius that woke up one day and invented the tactic that resolved everything. Right, this thing didn't even have a proper following. Right, other countries actually started to employ it. We see it with Hungary, that actually with Sigismund attempted this against the same Hussites, failing. But there is some successful example of Hunyadi against the Ottomans. Also the Ottomans using it, and eventually the Poles using it, the Russians using it. But at the same time, these tactics were already known from previous times. We find it at the Battle of Moy against the Mongols by the Crusades, right? So by the Western Crusades in the same Central European lands. We find Wagenburg also, the Battle of Crécy, right? And this is a tactic that you wouldn't believe actually it's used still today, or at least it's a precaution, right? It shouldn't make us think that the wagon was the thing, right? Just first of all, wagons were present in every single army at this time in history. The Hussite wagons were built, and at some point we will probably make a video about them, to naturally perfect the tactics that were enacted with them, but also there wasn't nothing specifically or particularly different, right, in them compared to others. We're functionalized to the use, but once again, it's the use we have to focus and the reason on, and the reasons why that was the use, and concentrate also on naturally the forces that were manning these wagons and how. Right, it's a bit like the longbow tactics of the 100 Years' War. Everybody's obsessed about the longbow as a weapon in itself. That surely gave a determining help to achieve all those astonishing victories that make it actually English armies of the 100 Years' War in history. If you look at the properly in the entire military history of that, in the numerical ratios, in terms of numerical inferiority, especially in that kind, and the astonishing series of victories, actually the strongest army in history, right? And I say this because lots of people say, it's the Romans, it's the thing, but it's contextual. It's not that you can't say that makes sense in every single age, or that it is a primacy that you should just pervade as look at the strongest army. But in terms of, it's sheer, it's a matter of numbers, right? It's not something you can deny on the base of other evidence. And there is something actually very similar the Hussites achieved in the same way. But that must be understood, once again, even for the English tactics, in the combined arms tactics, specifically looking also at the strategic context, not thinking that those tactics were, standardized in absolute terms, right? It's obvious that there was something, quasi-doctrinal in it at some point, but objectively it was also the strategic situations and the great numerical disparity that forced, for example, these armies on the defensive, right? Now, today we will see that, and there is evidence of Hussite wagon force being used offensively as well, which is very fascinating. It's an hypothesis. It's actually stated by important sources, and people tend to dismiss this. They're saying, well, it's probably an exaggeration. Well, probably the source who was writing about it specifically, we'll see later, which is Ptolemy, future Pius II, was, by the way, one of the most cultivated people in the world at the time, so knew something, of course, against the Hussites, that were enemies of against which the Crusades had been launched, multiple Crusades, right, as you know, by the Holy Roman Emperor against these Czech rebels. Was trying maybe not to demonize, but explaining certain details might have been exaggerated, but actually, I'm personally very positive about the fact that this may have been true. Right, on multiple occasions. There is also other evidence actually to that, and we don't understand too well how it happened. Right, an unfortunate disadvantage that I think we will face when we will make a video for every single battle of the Hussite wars is that these battles are not very well documented. Like Central Europe at this point is not as well documented like, say, Western Europe, and this historiographical differences are fundamental, unfortunately, for our level of understanding of areas were, fundamentally even very close. And considering in Europe, and considering that, especially to the Crusades launched against the Hussites, participated basically the entire Europe, right? The only Europeans that do not figure in this list are the Scandinavians and the Italians, and we can actually think, and we know that they were both involved in many ways, and for the rest, all the other countries participated explicitly. So you can imagine, and this is very important contextually, by the way, to the actual homogeneity that medieval warfare had reached in Europe by that time, right? In fact, there is nothing distinctive, not even in the Hussite weapons or armor, right? People say, oh, well, no, they use pole arms and pavieses in a certain way. Well, actually, those were employed in the same exact way everywhere, right? And even this increase of field fortification, which is a characteristic also of late medieval times, is something that elsewhere had also reached dramatically important levels. So once again, do not think that these tactics were just something that emerged for some strange reason that was unknown to the rest. It was just a combination of preconditions that allowed them to be used effectively and successfully the way they did. They also had an evolution, transformation. This is why today we speak mostly of this context, right? In terms of equipment, Bohemia, broadly meant Central Europe, at this point was pretty homogeneous, right? The neighboring Eastern Europe, so a higher use of, let's say, something closer to the steppe, like light cavalry, horse archery, and it doesn't seem here, especially in Bohemia, it was pretty much, the single most westernized of the Western Slavic countries. There was any difference, like with Germany, for example. The same armor and weaponry are absolutely homogeneous in the place. The elite would, like the knights, would wear at this point Italian armor, also Southern German that was beginning to to challenge the Italian dominance at this point in the field. Weapons were the same everywhere. Firearms that are also credited to, to have been developed in this specific context actually do not seem to me to be. They were very important in Hussite warfare, but they were nothing, more advanced than what had been pioneered in Western Europe, right? Firearms like the Pistola Taranisse and the Ufnitze that we'll see now, that there were something respectively like small arms, light field artillery, and heavy artillery were to be found in many ways elsewhere, but the Hussite wars seemingly developed them more, specifically in the area, right? As we were saying before, this area on average had, compared to Western Europe, less middle class. The nobility especially was gradually taking over in proportion. So they had mostly the problem of finding good artisans that skilled communities that could produce the stuff en masse, like it could happen, I don't know, in Flanders or in Italy or in other places where this properly technological aspects also were being perfected and implemented, right? And the firearm indicator, as we'll see, is also dramatically important because it shows properly in the Hussite wars lasted like 25 years approximately. It's a generation, basically. So it's not even a very long time, but it was very intense, right? And you can trace in this period probably an improvement, a development of specific arms to fit within these tactics in a, say, doctrinal sense, let's say anachronistically speaking. For the rest, other iconic weapons, for example, like the flail, right, were basically there. They were probably more useful in this context when the enemies attacked the wagon force, and the guys, as we will see inside them, gave that. We don't really know what happened when the enemy arrived against the wagon force. In my opinion, they had necessarily either to, most of them would remain. That there is this stereotype, this cliche of mostly the imperial heavy cavalry against the Czech peasantry, right? But the thing was a bit less asymmetrical than it sounds, right? There was cavalry, and indeed heavy cavalry also within the Hussite wagon forts, inside and outside them. Cavalry was very important. Cavalry warfare was very important to properly even employ the wagon fort, and it was used as even to attack the wagon fort in the effort to not make it form, which was the same tactics that both the Hungarians and the same Hussites that came to fight actually against each other at some point used against one another. It was seemingly a development of cavalry. Of course, the beginnings of the Hussites see the presence of poorer armies, like smaller, poorer, mostly peasantry armies. By the end of this period, the thing is being implemented. There's a lot of professionalism in there going on, even at least also the same people that had improved over time had looted the enemy dead and prisoners, or ravaged the armories of the castles they conquered. They also had a growing following. The problem in the Crusade is that the Hussite was spreading, had to be eradicated. But also the Imperials of Sigismund, that actually, there were German troops most of the time, so it's also basically the Kingdom of Hungary at some point that was providing ethnic, Hungarian nobility, had problems to, put together an army of, lots of cavalry. And we know from the Hungarian war, laws of recruitment, that it was extremely expensive now, especially by the beginning of the 15th century. The knight panoply was extremely expensive. Most Hungarian noblemen didn't even have an armor, we can say, because they simply couldn't afford them. Technology was becoming a thing, and of course against a wagon fort, you would think the most effective instrument, as we were saying before, is artillery. But try to find a large park of artillery in Central Europe at the time. This is not France, right? And artillery costs a freaking lot, right? And the Hussites developed it as well as mounted it on their wagon forts. There was a lot of speculations how the tactics actually took place even in terms of offensive with these things. We will see now. But I'm pretty sure they did, right? Flails were used, as we were saying before, mostly iconic weapon together with halberds. Halberds mostly, with these hooks to hinge the knights and pulling them down, to unhorse them and to break their armor basically with it. Other maces, other blunt weapons to cause internal trauma beneath the armor, right? But the flails also has this thing that, as you know, it wasn't this thing swinging in the air, rotating like you see in movies, and not even to be thrown against shields or armor proper, but mostly to make it, to make the haft banging on the shield and making the flail proper swing over the guy's head and crushing his skull from the behind, right? And so delivering the most of effective kinetic energy against the back of the enemy's head, which, if you think about it, presumably when the knightly elite assaulted this wagon forts, they also needed physically to try to push to break them, right? To try to dislodge them in some way, right? I presume, because otherwise you cannot charge, right? It's like the French cavalry against the stakes of the English archery and the men-at-arms. It's not that they didn't make it through or they just impaled themselves on them. Actually, they went through, and we know it, and it was an extremely bodily effort to just a 15th century knight to spend a lifetime of physical training for that was capable of performing. Always remember that these were pretty beefy guys. Like, you need to. There was all an energic balance to work with the armor, but you could actually make acrobacies with armor. Ask Marshal Boucicaut, right? There was a lot of physicality in this kind of warfare, and especially among the knights themselves, that were literally the ones at this point that could advance on battlefields that were increasingly loaded with dangerous, increasingly dangerous kinetic energy delivered by crossbows or ever more powerful firearms that are appearing, essentially without much of a harm from the projectiles proper, right? Also, pole arms are mostly like a weapon that people who don't have armor then must keep the enemy at a distance use, right? While the typical weapon at this time, men-at-arms sometimes don't even need to use the shield anymore, because armor has become, it's maybe not, it's mostly like the second half of the 15th century, but that's the trend, because if you're already covered in iron, you don't need a wooden shield in your hand. You prefer a mace that is just what you have to use to crush another guys in armor. So these guys were the ones that you would exactly send in the midst of the fray to break through, right? Especially these masses of, lightly armored peasants that would be chopped down dramatically easily without any other kind of support. So literally it was an extremely violent and physical thing, even to try to break through the Wagenburg, that was naturally trying and hoped to be done mostly in formation, because without collective synergy in that regard, it's difficult to even make a point. One guy can get in, but what can he do, right? The idea was actually to break through Wagenfurt so that there was a big enough gap to make cavalry pouring in mass inside of it, and these things definitely happened, right? It was extremely risky. So there are actually there is another factor to consider always, as we do as good Clausewitzians, that moral forces are the single most important thing ever on a battlefield. It's not that the same tactics replicated by people that were not so determined and fanatically zealous as the Hussites, especially the Tabaris, would have worked in the same way, right? Once again, this is not a coup of genius, right? It's a great adaptive capability. It's a matter of great vision, and surely, and of intelligence and of tactical innovation. But still, if these people hadn't been the guys they were in terms of motivation and in political goals, you would have not had the Hussite success. It's not about the wagon fort, right? It's not about technology. Let's stop being obsessed by this insane idea that has been brought about by the concept of military revolution since Parker, which is utter garbage. And, we thank, of course, the author for all the astonishing work he has done. But the concept of military revolution is just a tumor. It's nothing else, right? It's what is being constantly debunked step after step all over the way. Military success has basically nothing to do with military technology, right? It's all about moral forces and doctrine and lots of other things that are not properly given in military, right? Technology is just an aid. It's something secondary you develop to do things better, but it's not what makes the thing done, always, right? It's not true, this is not the case even now. You can imagine in the 15th century, where warfare was dramatically symmetrical. Once again, it was probably nothing technologically advanced in these tactics, right? It's the doctrine of it, it's the synergic employment of it that was freaking amazing, which is completely another thing, right? If one doesn't start from these bases, throw away military history books, because it will never work, right? And if the Hussites had not been poor in means, you would have never seen this thing, which is yet another proof of doctrinal superiority over technological advancement, right? That are not properly not on the same level, right? The second one is always subordinated to the first one in every single historical reality. So we're talking about also great commanders, great leaders. Think about Jan Žižka and the discipline that was enforced, right? We have actual documents that tell us how the Taborites were framed under this strict, in fact, disciplined set of rules that, of course, genuine enthusiasm for the much-needed church reforms preached by Jan Hussite was not enough to make things work, right? Courage is literally the cheapest of all moral resources that are needed in war, right? Everybody can be courageous. There's actually nothing special about it. Another thing is to be a military genius, which gets things done and is wholly another matter from a more complex set of moral qualities, right? We have, for example, this statutes and military ordinance of Žižka's New Brotherhood from 1423, right? It was signed by him in that year. And as you would expect, actually, from a document of that time, most of the content refers to religious matters. These people, you were talking about an age of absolute faith. Like, people were mostly driven by reasons that were religiously connected reasons, right? Of course, the reason why this whole thing happened, it cannot be reduced to a merely religious thing, but every single thing about it was connected to the religion, right? So it was naturally believed that divine help was, of course, well accepted, especially in these extraordinary military circumstances that required for as strict military discipline. We can read about something about this that refers of even some tactical hints. So, quote, when we want to leave some town or move away from some place where we have encamped in the field, no one shall ride in advance to the next town or walk or drive there to secure quarters or lodgings, nor shall anyone encamp in the field without the permission or order of his older captain. No one shall light a fire or set anything else on fire on the march or while lying encamped, except those who will be specially selected. When they move out from some place and before they undertake to order some enterprise in the war, they shall first make a prayer to the Lord God, and kneeling down before the body of God and before the face of God, pray the Lord God, the Almighty, will give us help, that they thus may wage this sacred war for the praise of his sacred name and for the enhancement of his beneficence. After that the people shall form in proper order, each troop under its standard, and once they have been assigned to a troop or formed under one standard, they shall march in good order. Whenever and wherever the Lord God grants us to overcome and defeat our enemies and conquer towns, fortresses, or castles, and thus to take booty, Then shall all things captured and all booty be carried and assembled at a place chosen and pointed out by our elders, be it much or little. Right. Also, we do not want to suffer among us faithless men, disobedient ones, liars, thieves, gamblers, robbers, plunderers, drunkards, blasphemers, leechers, adulterers, whores, adulteresses, or any other manifest sinners, men or women. These will banish or chase away, and will punish all such crimes by flogging, banishment, clubbing, decapitation, hanging, drowning, burning, and by all other retributions that fit the crime according to God's law, except no one from whatever rank or sex. Right? When Shishka captured the Adamists, he burned them alive. Right? These are the moral contexts that you have to think about, not what kind of weapon they used, right? But what they had in their mind, which is dramatically more useful for understanding any kind of political or military context alike, which is basically the same thing. These are pretty standard orders, issues, right? There is nothing that you can't say here it's mostly a Hussite thing, right? It's about a contained order. Everybody has to stick together. They have to obey. They don't have the loot is an important thing, but we should divide it all together, right? These were properly, as you know, a community that, as Tabor had grown, had gathered people from all over the surroundings, with this promise of being, in fact, it was named after Mount Tabor in the Bible, and there were also competitive cities in this regard. But this probably was a community that gave itself a single order, right? For what I was saying about tactical hints, actually there is no one, except the fact that recurred, and I remember where I've read it, however, on the emphasis put on the fact that nobody had to, even for example, I don't know where I've read it, actually, maybe it comes afterwards, but they didn't even have to light a fire. Nobody had to put camp, in fact, was not ordered, because it was fundamental in the, especially at a strategical level, and also for tactical employment of the Hussite tactics, that the enemy didn't spot the movements, right, of the Hussites. That, of course, this is also pretty standard for every army, but this whole thing had to be all done in a very orderly fashion. Every single piece of this army had to work together well, and in synchrony, because if the Wagenburg wasn't done in time, the entire army, often outnumbered, might have been overrun very, very easily, right? We were talking about weapons, and even here as we were saying before, there is this idea that properly that there was something special about the combination of Hussite weapons. I personally haven't seen any, right? Every single weapon was used here might have been used in a, not in an unconventional way, but maybe for the sake of the wagon fort was structured like. Before we were talking about the flail used in that specific context when you were maybe inside the wagon when this actually happened. The wagon was normally loaded in men that were thickly packed inside, and that actually didn't all fight together, right? During the battle, many of them had to dismount also because wasn't probably much space. Just think about reloading weapons, firearms, etc. Just the mobility of it. Still, there was a resistance, mostly outside the wagons, inside the circle, or even outside. There were frequent sorties as well. I've read that something plausible is, of course, that the lighter cannons, the Taranitsek, would be placed between one wagon and another because it was the only useful gap, and for shooting it's fine. People say these were protected by shields, by pavises, especially. How, why, where is this shown? How do we actually know? We know of mantlets that were placed sometimes to compose the fortification. Surely the same all the time, right? It wasn't something so tactically immediate as we think. This was built, and there was even the time to dig a trench, a ditch in front of them, right? So this is not about like a video game where everything happens at a small scale, a small tactic level. These things were movements that lasted an entire day, right? And that were, which the concept of wagon fort is obviously to create a fort out of nothing. Right, all armies made forts in the same exact way. Right, this thing had the advantage of being mobile. Right, and what does this tell you practically? It tells you practically there was nothing really special about it. That the what was different in this sense was mostly a strategical goal. Right, you know that the Hussites at some point even invade Hungary with their armies, with wagon forts. These had to be on the strategic offensive, and it's not even a matter of speed. Like the wagon armies were actually not speedier than other armies. Most people would actually proceed on foot. Right, the wagons are actually not easy to bring together. You need still they weren't so small, first of all, as armies in the first place. Naturally, the largest the army is and the slower it is, right? So even this actually, and considering that the most important Hussite victories were fought with, some thousands of men also from their side, so it's not a small army as you would actually think of, just one of a few hundred men that also existed, especially at the beginning. So the thing in itself has nothing specifically different from other armies, right? It's just this capability of evidently moving relatively fast in terms of, multiple days of march in a row, perhaps, and therefore this, necessity of even forming a fort more quickly, more readily, right? Instead of building it out of scratch, having just the wagons assembled and gaining time for, making the march longer during the day. That's probably the advantage. And it is to be considered in this sense that the spaces were opened, right? This wasn't like Switzerland, for which the Swiss could use their phalanx to stop the enemy on the mountain passes. This mostly in Central Europe, especially in the incursions in Hungary, not even in Bohemia, right? The terrains were difficult. You can imagine what the regions were like in the 15th century. And we will see, in fact, that the wagon fort was often employed. This explains more easily sometimes also how such astonishing tactical successes could be possible, were combined with terrain features like rivers or other. Sometimes the wagon fort wasn't completely surrounded. So, for example, they could deploy it in a convex fashion to concentrate fire from the approaching side of the enemy, right? So these are obvious realizations that shouldn't puzzle us more than much. It's that simple intelligence, right? It doesn't require that enormous effort to understand. What does require effort is to do it quickly and orderly in time, and with enough determination to use that as your defense line to resist against the assault of imperial cavalry, which is another very important thing. And this is what I would like to stress throughout all the whole video. It's mostly a moral reason, right? The wagons helped as hell, but without the moral force, you do not go anyway with this, right? The wagon naturally is a fortification that stops the enemy attacks. Cavalry cannot break through it properly and easily. They have to dismount. So naturally, also the emphasis on firearms. That the Hussites made considerable use now of firearms, handguns. Even seemingly the same term pistola is the one that would give origin. I don't know whether it properly came from the Czech and the weapons used by the Hussites in their tongue, but still, that was the future in some way. But as we were saying before, technologically speaking, these areas were not pioneering at all, developing firearms proper. If anything, these were more backward areas that were just developing this stuff now, right? There is an important divide, right, between what happened in Western Europe. We start finding firearms basically from the very end of the 13th century, certain areas of Eastern Europe, like, I don't know, Lithuania, or even beyond, where this stuff starts appearing like 1 century later, right? At least in the sources. It's not that there wasn't there, probably they spread at the same time, but quantitatively speaking, these people didn't have enough money to produce them, right? So it's all the more meaningful, actually, that these weapons were employed in this Hussite tactics, because it shows how effective they were, especially at close range, right? Because it's obvious that the knight arrives at very, just in front of you, in front of the cart, and you shoot him at that distance. Well, you can do a hell of a damage, right? Compared to other weapons. Also, considering that actually most of imperial troops at this point were pretty much armed as much as the Hussites were, right? They weren't fully armored, or at least not in metal, and therefore it was kind of easier to knock them down. Crossbows, even simple bows, slings, right? Weapons that by that time were even fairly primitive until of course, in this broader Central European frontier, which had always been something like that, because the steppes are actually a step away. The same Hussites actually invade the Pannonian Plain, which is the westernmost area of the Eurasian steppes. So also the idea of the wagon fort, we didn't stress it enough, but we know it was used since Scythian times. I mean, it was not new, right? It's what armies build where there is usually no major defense around or resources to build them with, right? These people were mostly farmers, and what all farmers could find around farmlands were these farm carts. And do you wonder why they were used? Because they had a lot of them, right? No specific technological calculation about it. They simply had a lot of carts because there were a lot of peasants. That's it. That's literally it. Right, and that's what is called intelligence, right? Making it of even the simplest thing an alternative use that others don't to obtain your goals. This is it, right? And that's what works in war, right? Not the highly sophisticated technological thing that regularly actually doesn't work, right? Because it's detached from reality most of the times. Other aspect. How did actually the war wagons began to be used, right? Mostly, as we've seen, there was a defensive approach. This defensivistic attitude was there regularly in the Middle Ages already. You can see it in the fortifications at Battle of Victor Hill in 1420 in the Hussite context, and it goes in parallel, as we were saying, like the same wagon fort to the average encampment that armies made, and that now, instead was hired up through these means, as we have explained. And historically speaking, it's been believed that, and there is a bit of debate about this, that started from the time of Oman, who basically suggested that Szyszka's experience in Eastern Europe had made him familiar with the Russian Gulai-Gorod, that is basically this movable fortress that, steppes influence that actually the Muscovite forces do not display historically, if not by the 16th century. It's also been believed that the Tannenberg campaign 1410, which Szyszka is believed to have served, might have influenced him in this regard because of the Lithuanians that might have used it, but there is no evidence of there. The point I make, so other historians have actually stated that it was actually the Bohemians, and the Bohemian example from the Hussite wars to spread it further. This is to other armies, including the Hungarians, the same Hussite wars, as I said before, eventually even beyond. The point, though, is, as we have seen also before, is that since the Battle of Moy, for example, in this still, Hungarians versus Mongols context, Hungary was very open to nomadic troops who were constantly settled within the kingdom's boundaries. Think about Ladislaus, the fort was even a half Cuman. He had an army of Cumans entirely because he distrusted the Hungarian ethnic nobility. There was this general acquaintance, even in Bohemian warfare, as a consequence, because the Bohemians and the Hungarians have always been kind of fighting around the same areas. There are largely, in fact, rural open grounds, right, and where cavalry had always played an important part, right. And as we were saying before, also this broader, let's say, central frontier of Europe has probably no boundaries with the East, right. From there on, it opened towards Poland. You already meet the steppe, right. There is that's probably where it begins. It begins in Hungary. It begins in basically in southeastern Poland, and there is this enormous area of millenary movement that continually poured waves and waves of nomads were often settled in places like Poland, as we've seen in Hungary, and that brought together with them this major custom of the steppes, even in zootechnical, equestrian capacities and specific technology. So the idea of the wagon fort that was used in the steppes since millennia at this point might have let's say, influenced the specific Bohemian use of it, but not much, because the Bohemians might have, say, copied it from somewhere. Let's also stop with these ideas of the people copy things. Like, of course, every single culture does not exist if not by having copied something, because that's how it begins, cognitively speaking, for every human being, right? So this also idea of cultural appropriation is complete nonsense by all standards of intelligence. The most successfully capable in intelligence and advanced peoples in history have been exactly the ones that have taken as much as they could in terms of this know-how from other places, made an original synthesis. There is something to be extremely proud of that, instead of the same people that just made a specific use from a contextual function, whatever it was, and couldn't go forward. Civilization is expressed exactly by how much synthesis of different elements you can make, and that's something that you come up with your own culture that makes it great, right? That's the point. But generally speaking, as we're saying now, let's say that this broader frontier that arrives to the gates of Germany is there, right, in the air, right? This the Mongols arrived at the gates of Germany. The Hungarians launched their own raids with their own nomadic troops that had settled, like the Cumans and others. These people knew what that practice was about. It was in their mindset. It was in their. They were fully sedentarized civilization. That by the 15th century, like Bohemia, as we were saying before, is like a chunk of Germany. In terms of, there's no practical difference. But in terms with northeastern Germany, it's the same thing. If not more advanced, actually, it's in certain centers. I think about the Prague of the Luxembourgs, but in general, the concept is not new. Like, it's normal that if you have to be on the move, and if you have this strategic need of speed and of sudden attacks and this combat rate that you're exposed and you need to be prepared at every moment, you tend to functionalize yourself with the overwhelming pressure, psychological pressure that you get from these situations, that you invent, in the sense that you develop that function of having this more readily available fortifications in a shorter time, right? So once again, what the Hussites did was probably a Czech thing with these wagons, right? It probably was born from there. There was the innovation, the concept of it in the functionalization of it with the various arms, Western Europe, that you don't find, in fact, in the other countries, right? The Wagenburg, even if the steppe, was manned in different ways. Here, the guys unite properly the most advanced technologies of the time, like guns, like this full Western panoplies that they disposed to that specific tool, we could say, this carts. This is pretty much it, right? The first two battles in which Žižka employed successfully the wagon fort tactics are Nekmer, right in the north of Pilsen, where he was attacked by royalist troops, and he, according to chroniclers, he defeated the enemies with inflicting them heavy losses with these 7 wagons, right? on which, quote, were those snakes, that is, the guns, with which they destroyed the walls, right? And this is the first example that you see is being achieved actually a few, a few wagons, right, that were enough eventually to fence off the enemies that we don't know for which reason might have broken. The Royalists were more, but actually, and they had a strong army in comparison to Žižka's one. But the smaller engagements are, and theoretically, the more we've seen it in phone clauses, that the outcome can vary in many ways compared to larger battles, right? So, how did the Hussites make it? They fanatically resisted. They scared the enemy with gunfire. They had this barrier formed with wagons. It's all of them, as far as we understand, right? We were not there. We have no idea through the sources specifically what may have happened, but these things can happen, right? There are lots of other accounts in medieval warfare, even just a handful of knights that charged, the knights charged in that sense, but just a few troops that managed to resist it hardly. Definitely here, there is something added to it, right? Even if these tactics have something to do with it, also considering the eventual developments, right? But this is the first time that tactic was used, right? And might have happened actually just out of desperation. And it turned out it worked. So that's why they began to implement it. The Battle of Sudomir in southern Bohemia, March 1420, right? At this point, Žižka's force was only 400 strong and poorly armed, right? The enemies were overwhelmingly superior. Right? At this time, what he did actually was to deploy with his flanks, protected by 2 lakes, respectively, right? Arranging at this point 12 wagons, so they had 5 more from the previous battle, to the other flank in his rear, so enclosing him between a natural barrier and the wagons, right? And at this point, the battle was fought bitterly, and there were heavy losses from both sides. But this was also the first significant victory of Žižka, and once again, it shows this tactics being successful. Right? Consider that this is not a video game. Like, we don't know the reasons why, what were the actual forces involved, morally speaking. Right? We can't reason in terms of numbers, or how many were from the other side. This was enough for whichever the assailants wanted to do to give it up, right? And that's what the good enough that makes the victory, right? And this was achieved in the sense with a complete surround, with a complete defense from all sides, right? And there are also examples. So I've met many of the troops deploying with the flanks to natural barriers. We all know it since the ancient world. Even here, that's a combination between things that were already known and covering now with only 12 wagons. They're not a lot. Consider that later Hussite armies had hundreds of wagons, right? So that is something different from this ones. So skip the construction of carts that we'll talk in another video, but let's say that these were functionalized in many ways to provide this extra mobility for the troops to embark, disembark. There were these mantlets that opened. Let's say when you open the cart, provided this extra support from one side. Their shape was functionalized to make them overlap naturally to form a good barrier. They were often chained, actually. And they also had this V-shaped volumetric form, so that there was more room at the top for moving guys that were like walls. The idea that the wall tends to protrude outwardly at the top at this point, so that the enemies have it worse trying to either to climb it or at least to even think to approach it from the bottom. Of course, these weren't dramatically tall wagons, but they were still useful to to be enough defended, it's difficult to, in full armor just to even try to climb there, especially if there is someone inside the wagon that is, going to shoot at you, or, hitting you with maces and flails and halberds and so on. Handguns, as we've seen, varied as it was normal at the time in size and in types dramatically. Every piece was handcraft made and was unique in its own kind, but naturally size mattered depending on what function they had. And there is evidence, as we will see in a while, of cannons, every ones, and I think Evan, this larger cannons were sometimes mounted proper. The Aufnitze on the in German Karrenbüchse, right, on the howitzer, let's say on the wagon itself, and so like a tank in many ways. Yeah, it's not like a tank technically speaking. It's still a cart that you make advance. Consider it's very slow, right? It has nothing to do with properly blitzkrieg or the use of tank as we came to think about it. Like a cart with guns on it. It's not a tank, right? Let's not confuse what something like the blitzkrieg is. Something extremely specific. First half of the 20th century, a specific doctrine, a specific context, has nothing to do with that. This is not a tank. Tanks did not exist before World War I. It's something, whatever you want to call it, but it's something different. So I say this because together with the concepts of military revolutions and other sensationalistic approaches, no, this is not the first employment of tanks, right, in history of warfare. And even if it's just like a wagon with artillery mounted on it, it doesn't have that function of the tank as we imagine it today. Just something that, of course, advanced, delivering fire and supporting, however, mostly the rest of the troops, right? It doesn't work by itself. It doesn't manage to surround the enemy to take it out by itself. If there are not other troops around, it doesn't work, right? And also first tanks were like this for that matter. We think actually, at the beginning of World War II, tanks made it alone. Actually, there were a few, and most of the thing was done by infantry in that regard. But still, this was mostly, as we will see, tactically speaking, a way to move a cannon on the field, right, and to create support for the advancing troops in different ways. It was used seemingly also to smash into enemy units. Sometimes they were launched and loaded with stones, for example, to be launched against the thickly packed formations of enemies that were, for example, climbing uphill, right, to disorder them and to attack them after these things had smashed through the lines, right? It's also quite clever, but once again, that's something that we use since ancient warfare, right, with stones and other stuff. So yeah, it's just a clever way of doing it, but conceptually speaking, once again, it's not a revolutionary thing. And considering the importance of wagons in Hussite warfare, right, you can't launch them like that only if you are pretty damn sure that with other troops you are able to win the battle and to follow tactical advantage, or otherwise they are lost, right? It could simply be destroyed, right? It's not that. Material was infinite at the time, and that's also something quite risky to do, and might have not even been necessarily the best thing in absolute terms to do, because sometimes people just freak out. Maybe at that point it was a cold, rational decision, and it was even effective for sure. But sometimes humans also do stuff that just seems handy at the moment, immediately, and it works, maybe accidental, right? So even in here, let's not crystallize even on the doctrine of this whole, because after all, this tactic eventually appeared, right? It's not that it had a following, right, overall. It happened mostly, as we have seen, in Central and Eastern Europe, in specific contexts where steppes influenced. But do you see this in Western Europe? No. Why? Because evidently it didn't work, especially if there was plenty of artillery around, right? Which makes this is a pretty rudimentary tactic after all. This is what I would like to stress. And that has nothing to do with whether it's successful or not. It was successful as hell. But it's contextual to that specific reality, right? Naturally, the Hussites, now we're concentrating very much on the wagon fort, but Hussites, for the rest, fought as other, any other army for that matter. They of course used artillery in siege warfare in the same way, that had armies that operate in the same ways. The use of the Wagenburg was mostly dictated by needs of defense, right? There were also other problems. For example, normally every wagon was pulled by 4 horses, right? And one problem is that naturally we don't know exactly how this whole thing were organized. We know actually of the very long list of troops that had theoretically to move on the wagon, and this tells you that theoretically this wagon was empty of other stuff, of supplies, whatever. So actually these armies had a great logistical problem. They were always hungry for new horses, for example, that to be found locally, already fed and hydrated. Think about all the enormous organizational complication that bringing wagons to make troops fight on them entailed, right? You had a lot of other wagons. Of course, these armies had other wagons that brought all the various supplies, etc. But still, you had to pull all these carts of hundreds of kilos. That costed a freaking lot, logistically speaking, right? So it's all extra force that you have to. They had problems in foraging, right? Part of the reason why probably they used the wagon itself, or at least that the wagon was a cause and consequence of, is that they had to move rapidly just to find new, fresh pastures for the horses to be fed. Right, horses were very precious. If the horse got killed in combat, of course, who pulled the wagon afterwards? So they were brought, actually, they were unhinged as soon as enemy was seen from the wagons, were brought together, chained, and all this stuff, and brought at the center of formation. Was properly and presumably, horses were mostly built. They might have actually even fought with the same horses in certain desperate situations, but if you have to use a fresh cavalry, the horse must be fresh himself. So we know of cavalry, of course, as we've seen, that intervened, especially towards the end of the battle, to pursue the enemy, because otherwise, you should defend. But when you break the enemy, if you don't pursue it, you lose a dramatic advantage in this regard. The larger Hussite armies could contain as much as 180 war wagons, which meant there were others, naturally, and about 35 of the larger guns. There's a pretty, as we've seen, Hussite armies were, on average, fairly compact, right? They weren't dramatically large armies, but 35 guns of the larger type is not bad in this regard, considering that this wagon fortress, was therefore something like 5, like one gun every 5 or more wagons, right? So it's a very good proportion after all, and this tells you also how important this defense was to properly deliver not just a passive defense but an active one. In this, they were shooting against the approaching enemy, right? And this scares horses and and kills naturally. At the same time, these are just the larger guns, right? So there are lots of small ones, and this is why the Hussite tactics are rightly regarded as some of the first effective implementation of firearms in in a dedicated function, let's say, that of concentration of fire in open field, especially for their deployability, right? So you can imagine, if you had approached these things, you would feel a rain of stones and balls of various types pouring against you. That's an important thing to do, and you have to dismount because you can't crash with the cavalry against the wagon, or at least you can do it, but they are chained, so it will not pay for much. So you have at least to try to dismount, and especially if the chariots are chained, right, which something can go wrong, and sometimes the enemy made it through, and they were chained usually just during combat, because one objective of the Hungarians, at least at some point, was to attack the enemy, while the wagons were not put in the a rectangular perimeter and are not arranged like that. Basically, this is how it worked. There were the wagon line moved ahead in 4 columns. So in march, there were these 4 parallel lines, the 2 outer ones known as the kraitny, and the 2 inner ones as the plaksny. I really, it's pronounced, but can't be mistaken. So naturally you have this external lines that are longer and the ones that are smaller, that are shorter. So when you had to pass in combat formation, the longer ends closed inwardly to cover basically the smaller ones, which did exactly the same. So you had actually 2 circles, right? These were multi-circular fortresses, so they were just like castles, multiple walls, perimeters, that even if you broke through one, there was still another one inside to store, right? And that's an extra defense in that regard, that tells us that the Wagenburg was also assaulted successfully sometimes, aside even when it was not broken proper. Someone made it to climb and inside and to start beating the other or shooting them in some ways. It should be pointed out that in some situations when the Hungarians brought bombards, like a considerable part of artillery with them, the Hussites retreated quickly because they knew perfectly well. Of course, you stayed under bombardment. At that point, the bomber was becoming, can say obsolete. Yeah, I mean there were other types of guns that were developing. That was enough, right? At the beginning of the 15th century, of course, to smash this wagon, so it wasn't even the most developed artillery. So this tells you about its vulnerability in other contexts had this been tried elsewhere as well, right? So there was this wrapping around of the lines that close together with themselves together in this defensive formation to make a close perimeter, right? And that's how the defense began. Ditches actually were, as we've seen, were built outside. So this became like a little castle, and that's what the objective was, to create a camp, like all camps were built at the time, in the same exact way, right? Naturally, as we were saying before, when this maneuver was completed, the horses were unharnessed, right? Also, the wagon shafts were either removed altogether or raised vertically or placed against the preceding wagon, and the wagons were chained together, right? And the protective panels released, right? The other people say, shields were placed in the pavises in between the wagons. We don't know how this thing was done practically, right? Or whether there's this idea that the pavis is just something, either, but this time it's eventually become mobile, like even single troops have the pavis. But we read pavis, man, we don't practically know. There were pavises that were even used in hand, others on the back, others were just fixed on the ground. Even at that point, how you distinguish them exactly from the mantlets were fixed either on the wagons or in the front. So it was the whole thing together that made the function, right? There's no specific technicality of how troops might have been arranged that justifies the success of this formation for what it is essentially like a camp. Do you think there are sources that tell us that camps were, in some gaps, had the pavises fixed on them? I mean, how is important, right? Compared to the palisade, to the ditch, to the wall, even the towers were built. What's the point of that detail that matters? I say this because it's plenty of and there's booklets that talk about this stuff as, I don't know where they take the information from. Maybe there is a source that explicitly says that. So, but at the same time, let's try to be flexible about it. Let's try to stress that it's the ensemble that makes its tactics functional, right? It's not the single detail about it. Everything was functionalized, right? But it's to be stressing here that in order to make all these maneuvers, the troops that achieved that carried it out, had to be dramatically trained, right? Because it's not easy at all, right? And especially there has to be a commander has enough eye to say, okay, let's deploy in this specific the specific ground or another place, because that can really make the difference from one place or another. In fact, those who attempted, like the Hungarians, for example, to replicate this tactic at some point, they didn't use it pretty well. Was a disaster. There was also some skepticism about their function, and objectively, at some point, might have even been true. Like that, there probably were, given other contexts, other armies, other means, probably other better ways to deal with the wagon fort. It wasn't just replicating the wagon fort against it. Although, as we've seen, the same Hussites actually used it against one another at some point. So the wagon line could be modified during the battle. This is also the important thing, and many people say, well, it was a defensive thing. Yes, it was, because the circumstances made it so in many battles, but they could be used more autonomously, right? First of all, just think about cavalry that at some point had to be set forth out of the formation. So they had to open some part of the line to let the cavalry out and to pursue the enemy, or to attack it from the flank. They were trying to storm the wagon line, and so on. There is this controversy of saying, but were wagon forts also used in attack? The answer is easily yes, right? The only problem is we don't know exactly how it happened. One can, make hypotheses. And there is especially this, and as Silvius Piccolomini in his passage, as we were saying before, the future Pope Pius II, this Sienese humanist who was dramatically cultured and educated, who wrote famously about the Hussites. And this also tells you about those historiographical differences. Before that, we need a Pope to tell us what the enemies of the Crusades fought like, and not having the same passage, the same detailed explanation from other sources. Now, this is controversial, but let's analyze it in some way, because it says a very interesting thing. It says, when a battle was about to begin, the drivers, at a signal from their captain, quickly encircled a part of the enemy army and formed an enclosure with their vehicles. This is the most important part of the passage. I repeat it. When a battle was about to begin, the drivers, at a signal from their captain, quickly encircled a part of the enemy army and formed an enclosure with their vehicles. Then their enemies, squeezed between the wagons and cut off from their comrades, fell victim either to the swords of the foot troops or the missiles of the men and women who attacked them from above from the wagons. The mounted troops fought outside the wagon stronghold, but moved back into it whenever the enemy threatened to overpower them, and they then fought dismounted as if from the walls of a fortified city. In this way they fought many battles and gained as many victories as possible, because the neighboring peoples were not familiar with such methods. Bohemia, with its broad and level fields, offers good opportunities to align carts and wagons, to spread them apart and bring them together again. Beautiful. And I stop it here because there is the rest. So let's analyze it first of all. So here it explicitly says that at least a part of the enemy army was encircled by the Hussites, right? Forming literally an enclosure with the vehicles. And the enemies were squeezed between the wagons, cut off from their comrades, which is to say, well, at this point you haven't just encircled them, you've cut them off. Have you encircled like an entire wing, for example, or others? Is there did you have to break through? We'll see it later. This is explicitly stated at some point. Victim either to the swords of the foot troops or the missiles of the men and women who attacked them from above from the wagons. Now, this is interesting because it shows something predictable, that is that, of course, the troops that still fought alongside the wagons, that could even attack in this regard, were the most armed one, here says with the swords, infantry, or the missiles that were evenly, this says men and women, right? So these were probably unarmored even, who attacked them from above from the wagons. So the wagons are seen mostly actually as a place, as a shooting position, right? Not even properly a combat area. At least the combatant troops were mostly on foot, and it's obvious even just for terms of deployability, all the troops could not be mounted on the wagon. What for exactly? Also for not maneuvering, for preventing them from exploiting their full potential, and so on. This says the cavalry fought outside the wagon stronghold. So here it sounds as if it's not properly. Here before we've seen that this thing has encircled the enemy. Now it's a stronghold in seemingly a defensive sense. But we know the cavalry eventually made sorties, and it moved back into the stronghold whenever the enemy threatened to overpower them. Right? So this is also not surprising, actually, that there were opportunities to be seized with sudden sorties that could surprise the enemy, and this was done also, historically with camps and so on, right? And when they retreated, they could dismount and as if from and fight from the walls of a fortified city, right? So this is properly also the role of cavalry, of the professional elite that naturally is able to fight regularly on foot as much as on horseback, right? And as we have seen in hand-to-hand combat, is actually the best unit you can have, and especially if it's defending, right? It's even less like it's bulwark that you can very difficultly break, especially with this added fortification. Many people said, this passage is exaggerated because it sounds as if literally, even in the same passages, there is, as we pointed out, an attacking part and a defending part that do not quite connect with one another. But what Piccolomini states in another passage says, as soon as the battle signal was given, the drivers developed their movements against the enemy according to certain figures or letters that had previously been indicated to them, and formed alleys which, well known to trained taborites, became a hopeless labyrinth for the enemy, from which he could find no exit, and in which he was caught as in a net. Right. This is also very important because it substantially states that the circles that were created with wagons could be actually of different shapes, right? And they were not properly and necessarily circles, which is actually very realistic if you think about it. Remember before we made those examples in which the wagons actually covered just one part of the Hussites army's flank, right? Flank multiples, but not totally, right? So it could be as well that just one side in the battle could be fortified, right? That these wagons were of course combined, given that they were mobile in different shapes, and that also during the battle could advance thanks to the firepower that they had on them, and to be supported by other troops that could, in a sense, try to outflank the enemy in the process. So this is not actually so. Like here, he states literally that once again, this idea of the encirclement because of the hopeless labyrinth from which the enemy cannot come out, as if he had been caught in a net, right? But this is quite realistic because also, given that battles are usually fought like in a, let's say, conventional sense, in the approximate meaning that naturally there is a logic, including the counteroffensive one, that needs troops, as we've seen, to just even pursue the enemy or counterattack. So you have to give them room for maneuverability, for cohesion, right? You can't just leave your entire war inside the wagon fort. You have to come out at some point. So you may wanna, I don't know, maybe you have one flank protected by, I don't know, by a force, and you want the other flank to be protected just with the cars, and then you deploy them just there, for example. Or maybe you bring forward others during the battle, that the enemy, where the enemy has gathered around one line and is a holding, you maybe manage to attack them from the flank. So it's plausible, actually, and we don't have to think of these battles in a dramatically orderly fashion as well, right? There is always a logic in that sense, but it could as well be that you can make it like just as there are many ways in which single defensive posts, like as this turrets shooting missiles, can be deployed, right? Thinking in a scattered, like in a in-depth defense, so that you have the enemies to enter into this labyrinth of various cards scattered here and there that shoot you from another direction, that maybe are between you and the rest of the army. It's also an interesting tactic, might have been employed. Seeing this is really an important thing to stress, especially considering also the firepower that we have observed before, right? And as Silvius Picconi writes also, when the enemies were broken up, cut off and isolated in this manner, the foot troops easily completed their full defeat with their swords and flails, or the enemy was overcome by the marksmen standing on their wagons. You see here, Zizka's army was like a many-armed monster, which unexpectedly and quickly seizes its prey, squeezes it to death, and swallows up its pieces. Right? This is very evocative. Naturally, he's describing, once again, the guy against which Crusades had been, the leader of the movement against which Crusades were launched, right? So, obviously, a prelate would a Catholic, in a Catholic perspective, head back to the Holy Roman Emperor, and his effort wanted to represent the Hussite army as a kind of a diabolical thing. But let's also be consistent about the fact that this might have been, a much more dynamic tactic than just a defensive one. There's really nothing strange about it, as medieval warfare usually was that dynamic as well. Right? Don't think that armies were like just medieval armies were rudimentary pieces of that didn't quite move, that just had especially at this time, tactics were becoming very dynamic in many ways. Combining arms, even this single pockets of knights that acted individual. Battlefields could be extended and across kilometers. It was a very dynamic game of castles, right? Of this, that was what most warfare was about. What battlefields were becoming, right? With ditches, trenches, turrets, palisades, trying to make it. It was all adapted to terrain. There were extenuating assaults, right? Siege warfare habituated to all this stuff. It was even much worse in many ways. So you can imagine a more, even a wagon fortress that is less rigid, definitely than a castle or other, even a palisade or other fortifications can produce. Right, in terms just of how the troops can get scattered, right? You may even actually want to employ them that quickly. Deployability, and the most important thing we get from this passage is that this formation didn't contemplate a continuous perimeter, right? But something more fluid. And if you think about the logic of chaining the wagons, you understand that they're still mobile. It's like a long snake that can, move and be headed, and even on different terrain and so on, and advance. And as it advances, it's like a train, right? Think of it as a train, like the trail follows, right? And with that, all the shooting, the first of all the movement. Think about, of course, moving them was dramatically difficult, as we were seeing before. The same horses were tended to be spared, but even just slowly speaking, these were still imposing things to approach. So that had that function, and it's obvious that there was a tactical situation to exploit, like seizing one terrain that the enemy had left open on the rear, etc. Why not? You would do it with cavalry, of course, but you could do it also by sending other troops in that could be just on the cards, right? We have other two interesting examples that can help us understand the Wagenburg in action, right, and its offensive role, right, and especially of Wagenfort against Wagenfort. Interestingly enough, there is the Battle of Domažlice, right, fought during the Fifth Crusade in 1430. And when the Hussites began to attack, the Crusaders' main troops began to retreat, right, and together with their wagons, actually, which they tried to bring to a force and to construct a Wagenburg in there, right, and Cesarini from the distance could look at the thing and see how basically the same wagons were running, right, while the Hussites were advancing against them, and they started constructing this Wagenburg, but the Hussites were pressing too close behind, and basically they penetrated the Crusader position, and the Crusades abandoned their baggage and equipment, and they actually left into the hands of the Hussites the largest booty taken in the entire war, right, including Cardinal Cesarini's hat, right. So this is kind of interesting. At the Battle of Domažlice, therefore, the Hussites demonstrated, if anything, that if you want to use a Wagenburg, at least you should know how to do it, but also, and more importantly, that actually this could become an effective thing had it been deployed before. And what the Hussites did here specifically was to prevent the construction of the Wagenburg in the first place, beating the enemy on time in that regard, right? And that's part of the competence that naturally is required to handle it. And there is another example at the Battle of Lipany, famously in 1434, where an alliance of the Hussite brotherhoods was defeated by another alliance of Czech noblemen and Prague's townsmen, and the brotherhoods had taken up a position on the low hill of Lipska Ora, right? That gave them some advantage because they could see the surrounding plain from there, and of course they had the advantage of the height. And their opponents, the lords, let's say, they were superior in numbers, ignored this with calm, right? They actually began to move their wagons uphill against the enemy in a long formation, right? In the end, this hemmed the brotherhoods inside their camp. So there was a mess here because, especially of the dense smoke that drifted across the battlefield from both sides' artillery, that this time, whenever it began to shoot, it was a kind of a mist form. And the thing actually helped to mask the offensive maneuver of the lords. And it was actually a similar maneuver, in here we see, to the one Piccolomini described, because it was offensive. Like the noblemen, say, were surrounding the brotherhood in moving the wagons forward, right, properly, and even uphill. Right, so consider here even the effort, and therefore the need, even to bring the wagons closer. So, if that happened in an uphill, you can imagine how this can be done even downhill or even on flatland. So this, in many ways, actually proves even the offensive capability, the regularly, applicable aggressive role of the wagons, right? At this point, the lords ceased firing, right, and began to descend the hill again. We don't know why, whether it was a pre-planned maneuver, as in most cases, actually, if you make the effort to do this, it's like the feint flight, like think about Hastings, other times when there are troops charging uphill and eventually they retreat. Eventually the battle turns out in favor for them when they counterattack, but so that people say, it was a feint flight, but was it? Right? Because usually that's not a good idea, right? To retreat in the face of the enemy for no reason. And even if you're trying to lure him, it's still something that costs a lot, especially pushing these wagons uphill. It's exhausting. So what happens though is that the brotherhoods concluded that the army of the noblemen was moving downhill, albeit very slowly. So this sounds also as a contained maneuver, and that's maybe where the suspect that this was a prearranged plan may be the case, but still also the fact that, watch out, because when you retreat, also, if the wagons weigh a lot, of course, it's very tiring to push them uphill, and also, controlledly bringing them down, and also you need them because especially if they're loaded with missile troops that can cover you, during the retreat, those can provide you cover, right? So what happens is the Brotherhoods believe the enemy is fundamentally retreating, and they pursue them downhill. Right? At this point, right, the knights and the foot soldiers pour down into what was thought like a disordered wagon formation, right? So the same Brotherhoods actually had knights on its own, right? So these were Hussites fighting against each other. So in many ways, they were very, very homogeneous in composition. What happened though is that the Brotherhoods became trapped, right? The foot soldiers being trampled to death or cut down by the nobles, horsemen. The lords made a counterattack at this point back uphill towards the now generally disordered Wagenburg of the Brotherhoods, right? And in this way, the Brotherhood was crushed and its leaders killed, right? And this is interesting because it shows also that the counterattacking Brotherhoods didn't carry out this maneuver orderly. They actually seem to have messed up their own formation all by themselves, right? Seemingly. Then, of course, we don't know. But this may be even a hint about the fact that aside from broader, the defensive tactics of the Wagenburg usually employed, like, there wasn't much of a, tactical sophistication even in the counterattack, right? After all, as we've seen, they were usually, they were skilled veterans at some levels, but some of them were not technically professionals, right? Most of them were, just brought there. The situation was still the same kind of gap difference between the professional elite and the rest of the troops. As we've seen, these were like other medieval armies, right? More or less skilled, depending on experience, chiefly, but still basically the same. So it's not that the average infantry could perform this dramatically, orderly maneuver without much of a training from their side, right? And we see even the noblemen here cause something of this in the usual contempt towards the foot, towards the peasantry that said, what the hell are these guys? We've seen before that, some nobility backed the Hussite movement, but it was mostly like for a broader autonomy of Bohemia from foreign interference at some levels, right? Because this is also kind of more complicated than that, but it's not that they liked the peasantry. Of course, they thought they were subhumans. And as such, maybe they just even ran over them, right? Because they didn't care particularly much. The important thing, though, is that at Battle of Lipany, the two halves of the Hussite movement began to destroy each other, right? And this is what actually brought to the same end, not just of this Hussite movement, but of the wall tactic that Jan Žižka had began with these war wagons. That lasted, as we've seen, for a relatively few time. So what's the point to be learned in here, right? We could say else. Like, first of all, there is over time, also from the Hungarian side of the story, we didn't much observed, but it's also very important because these were the guys that mostly suffered from the Hussite wagon fort tactics. But seemingly, in parallel to the, we can say was exactly whether it was a cause or consequence, it was both things at the same time, but, both the Crusader armies and the Hussite ones began to increase their cavalry contingents, their mounted contingents. This is important because, first of all, armies began to be larger in general, right? So this means that the wagon in itself, even if it was increased in number, in practice, is also something cumbersome, something that can never cope with a more tactically articulated army that, functionally speaking, has always worked the way it did without any wagon, right? So cavalry was important to seize positions, naturally to scout, whatever, and to support the same wagon deployability. Because what the Hungarians had learned against the Hussites is that if they had attacked them with fast troops like light cavalry that Hungary always plenty of at some levels besides the nobility, that sometimes could even serve tactically even as light cavalry, not always, but we've seen the problems for the Hungarian equipment at that point in the Hungarian knights. They could prevent, like we've seen in the previous battle of Domažlice, the deployment of the Wagenburg, right? They could actually attack the Wagenburg when you're still in column formation and pour through and make a slaughter. And this is actually what happened at some point at the Battle of Nagy-Szombat, where actually the Hungarians attacked the Hussites from the two opposite ends of the column. So one failed, the other actually made it. It went through. This caused massive losses in close combat, right? Also telling us that technically, without the wagon fort, also the troops inside weren't this enormous deal against the cavalry that normally was, at this point, the greater element out there. As we were saying before, in Central Europe, the situation was at the beginning of the 15th century much more medieval, let's say, than Renaissance in compared to Western Europe. So that the nobility proper was like there wasn't this important infantry element like in other countries, like in Switzerland, like in other countries. It was increasing importance in the Burgundian armies, in the Venetian conduct, and so on, right? So even the Hussite movement, as far as I know, does not show anything like that. Like, the innovation, the genius of it was to constantly entrench yourself in this way with the wagons and to increase the firepower, close range. But as far as the resistance of isolated infantry actually is concerned, which is the only way you can actually measure its strength, in absolute terms against the cavalry, where there doesn't seem to be evidence of that, right? So even this sense that our Renaissance warfare was about the democratization of warfare, it was the peasantry, the infantry, it's not really correct, right? Actually, the history of the Renaissance is a triumph of princely armies at every level. The pikemen that are starting to rise en masse are not just free guys, right? They are actually people paid by monarchs, right? Just the Swiss, yes, are like, but by the mid 15th century, when they fully developed the square formation, they're now kind of a state on their own in many ways, in spite of course, their confederal nature, their more kind of democratic character, but eventually also they get surpassed famously at the beginning of the Italian wars by the combined arms tactics, by the French, by the Venetians, by the Spanish actually as well. So that system also doesn't hold with actually autocratic against armies of autocrats that were capable now of fielding the real assets like massive amounts of artillery, of pikemen plus arquebusiers, and all those things for which the typical peasantry that rebelled, that sometimes was successful, of course, in medieval warfare, especially in the first half of the 14th century, didn't actually create any continuity, right? I'm actually very involved in this stuff for my work, so I know that to some ears this can sound strange, but really what the mainstream, I don't like the term mainstream, but let's say all the average magazines or disclosure in books or whatever, designed to attract people, especially young people of this last millennial generations, to show, oh, look, it's about medieval warfare. Like there is usually this cliche that is, not very challenged as far as I've seen, about the fact that, as I repeated before, late medieval warfare is about the increase of the free communities that rebel themselves, and there is the democratization. There is none of that, right? Infantry rose in importance, absolutely true, but that has nothing to do with that. If you want to find that, look at the first half of the 14th century and see how it actually finished, and see how it actually didn't bring to any other development, because even the Swiss that began the thing again by, that survive mostly also thanks to the terrain and certain, ground situations in those battles, reinvent basically another type of warfare by the mid 15th century that had nothing to do with the ones of the early 14th where they also had gathered their victories. It was a completely different thing, right? The first thing was just a bunch of peasants, whatever they had in their hands, in thickly compact masses, taking all the cavalry charges in a bloodbath, or at least they made it. By the mid 15th century, what you see in Switzerland is thousands of men rigidly framed with a brutal discipline imposed from the above, and as professional troops, they were continuously drilled to perform maneuvers that infantry, since ancient times, had never been able to achieve, which is wholly another thing that opens to Renaissance warfare. And it still has its roots in Switzerland, but as a model, it's born properly at that point as a different thing from what it was before. So never fall into the mistake that this idea that there is this continuous growth in late medieval warfare of infantry as such. No, especially by the second half of the 14th century, actually there is a refeudalization of warfare. And if we look at places like Central Europe, it was, generally speaking, if you look at, northern Germany, these areas also of Bohemia, Poland, Hungary, there is still the usual medieval order of things, like the knightly elite at the top on horseback, and the rest of peasantry didn't really put up much of a resistance in practice, right? Unless these were the Dithmarsche, once again, in the swamps, whatever. That was one thing, but it's mostly a problem of maneuvering. It's not about the absolute value. There is a beautiful book by Kelly de Vries. It's actually about the first half of the 14th century that poses specifically this question. Okay, we know that period were like something like 30 victories of infantry in a very few time. But the question is, how much was it due to the enemy's mistake or the favorable ground altogether, and what was about the real resistance of infantry? Right, and the answer there is that kind of a good half wasn't actually about the quality of that infantry, aside from, of course, the guts they had to count on the field, but they would have not won if the enemy had not screwed up massively, wrong maneuver, or because they were favored by terrain, whatever, and that is not less important, but still it is. In terms of the intrinsic value of the infantry, that still is an important thing to do. That is not to reduce military historical analysis simply to, once again, football matches, right? Who won, who lost, because that's not history, that's not intelligent, and it's actually pretty boring and stupid to do in the first place. So, for as far as the Hussites are concerned, now we will talk about them. Again, I promise, we're actually entering the details of the technicalities, even of how the wagons were built, all the stuff, their equipment, and all the battles of the Hussite wars that are at least the most important. There are several and are interesting, and I hope to find actually primary sources on, because those are the only ones that actually matter if you want to study this stuff. That it's very complicated, it takes weeks if not months. I wrote an entire master thesis in 1 year about one single battle plus campaign, but just for saying that's how you should do the thing seriously, and therefore I do a video a day. I can't, in 2 days, prepare this and pretend that you have seen it. But if you have just the major sources and this tells you something important and that it can't go, always bear in mind that wherever you read things without sources at hand, primary sources at hand, it becomes really difficult to understand, right, what you're talking about for real, and most of the times you're just repeating what someone else is telling to you, right? Even these battles that I've described to you today, actually, I've read them from a study, right? I haven't checked the actual first-hand source, except from Piccolomini, that we actually quoted him directly, but it's also a very famous quote, and as you understand, a bit detached from the contextual reality, but it still says very interesting things. But properly about every battle, maybe, I don't know, there are, I'm just guessing, there are, at this point, I think many chronicles, but half of them just say on which day was fought and who won, who lost. like a fourth of them actually gives some important tactical, information, and possibly even none of them actually reconstructs coherently the whole thing. So that's where you should take all the sources. They may be in, I don't know, Czech vernacular. I don't know, you need all an expertise. Obviously, I don't have all of this stuff, so I can do it for certain specific languages, but especially takes a lot of time to do it. So this is another proof that if you're not an expert, the best thing you can do is just to try to reconnect what you're reading to what you already know decently enough, and to stay open to the fact that you could learn more from it, and that, generally speaking, it's very difficult to understand in a medieval battle what even happened in the first place. You think that, Azincourt, right, is, we know how the battle went, like one of the most celebrated battles in Western history, it's so famous, all the stuff about. Do you think you actually know we know how it went? We don't. Not even the eyewitness actually understood what was going on. And there is an enormous work behind the whole thing that should be very important to make all the time before stating something that eventually is not completely clear. So, of course, I have expressed to you my own opinion. This is fact checkable. So, it's perfectly criticizable, and that's why we will go more in depth to the actual battles, because they also all are different in many ways, and from those differences you can understand sometimes a lot about the whole thing. But the gist of this whole thing is that Hussites' wagon force tactics were something very important in medieval warfare, very innovative, genial, right, for the employment of it and for these results achieved. These things actually worked, and yet they were the product of a very specific reality, of a combination of factors that are to be found just there. It's not a set pack of notions that you can replicate everywhere to make things work. It's not something that actually left enormous traces eventually afterwards. It's not that medieval warfare and Renaissance warfare evolved towards wagon force. It didn't, and if so, there is a reason. And warfare is where the most rational choices are made ever. Human societies usually. Contrarily, that we're constantly bombarded by, from myths like that, World War I generals were just butchers, and the poor soldiers were just sent to die for no reason nor logic. Study World War I, study World War I warfare, what it's really about. Utter cliche that we're all tired of, right? It all starts from the idea that you are no one to criticize someone that was there, did the actual thing. If you're not a specific expert, and even if you were, you still should be aware, historically speaking, that you still don't know, and you can't not have been the same person who was there at the time, and wonder if you would have done the right choice or not, right? So we're really navigating in the midst of very difficult waters, let's say, actually. From a historical point of view, especially for the Middle Ages, we have to be mostly coherent with ourselves before then, trying to find the coherence in the sources, because the sources, once again, are even here just a product of a specific context, and you must first of all understand the context, otherwise you cannot interpret it properly. But for now, we'll stop it here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.